Week 7 Economic Responses to World Wars. World War I and its economic impact. World War I, from 1914 to 1918, dramatically reshaped global finances, national economies, and trade networks. Known as the Great War, it engaged powers like Britain, France, Germany, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and later the United States, with sweeping effects on economies worldwide. The conflict led to significant destruction, loss of life, and economic instability, with lasting consequences on the global economic landscape. 1. Economic devastation and government spending. The massive scale of World War I demanded unprecedented government spending, particularly in Europe. Nations like Britain, France, and Germany redirected substantial resources to military expenditures, straining national budgets and increasing public debt. War funding primarily came through borrowing, both from domestic populations and foreign lenders, especially in the United States. Britain and France, for instance, received extensive loans from American banks, boosting the United States' global economic position post-war. The focus on military production strained other sectors, leading to shortages and rising inflation. As labor and resources were diverted to support war efforts, consumer goods dwindled, driving up prices and placing additional financial pressure on citizens. Many governments resorted to printing money, which further fueled inflation and devalued their currencies. 2. Disruption of trade networks. Before World War I, Europe was the heart of global trade, with extensive trade routes across Africa, Asia, and the Americas. However, wartime blockades, notably by the British Navy, disrupted trade flows and limited the import and export of essential goods. As a result, many European nations faced shortages of food, raw materials, and other necessities. This forced countries to become more self-sufficient. With Europe inwardly focused, other regions, particularly the United States and Japan, seized the opportunity to strengthen their manufacturing capacities and fill gaps in international trade. By the end of the war, the EU had become a significant exporter, securing a stronger international market presence. 2. Post-war economic crisis and hyperinflation. After the war, European economies were left devastated. Infrastructure, especially in France and Belgium, lay in ruins. Rebuilding required substantial investment, but many countries were financially drained and heavily indebted, creating widespread economic instability. Germany, bearing the heavy burden of reparations imposed by the Treaty of Versailles, was hit hardest. To meet these obligations, Germany's government resorted to printing large quantities of currency, leading to catastrophic hyperinflation. By the early 1920s, the German mark had lost nearly all its value, decimating the savings of ordinary Germans and destabilizing the economy. This hyperinflation and economic distress in Germany also affected other European economies closely tied to Germany's market. This financial turmoil hampered recovery efforts and created a fertile ground for political extremism, contributing to the rise of fascism and eventually leading toward World War I. 3. Shift in economic power. World War I marked a significant shift in economic power from Europe to the United States. As European nations struggled with debt and rebuilding, the EU emerged as the world's leading creditor and industrial power. American industries had rapidly expanded during the war to meet Allied demand, setting the stage for an economic boom that positioned the EU as a dominant force in global finance. The American dollar gained prominence, gradually overtaking the British pound as the world's preferred reserve currency. 4. Long-term effects on global trade. and the economy. World War I fundamentally altered the global economic landscape, diminishing Europe's dominance and empowering new industrial powers, notably the United States and Japan. European nations faced long-term financial constraints that hindered economic growth and spurred the rise of nationalist economic policies. The EU leveraged its newfound position as a global creditor to influence world economics, while the League of Nations, partly established to foster economic cooperation, proved largely ineffective in preventing future conflicts. The economic disruption and unresolved political tensions from World War I contributed to the global instability that ultimately led to the Great Depression of the 1930s. The weakened economies and strained international relations of post-war Europe exacerbated the Depression's effects and increased global tensions. Thus, the economic impact of World War I reverberated worldwide, setting the stage for another conflict and reshaping global finance, trade networks, and economic power in ways that remain evident today. The War Economies Treaty of Versailles. World War I fundamentally transformed participating countries into war economies, with national resources, industries, and populations redirected toward the war effort. The post-war Treaty of Versailles then profoundly impacted these economies, especially Germany's, by imposing harsh reparations and economic constraints that reshaped the post-war landscape. Together, these wartime economic shifts and the treaty's aftermath set the stage for further economic struggles, political tensions, and, ultimately, World War I. War economies' redirection of national resources. The transition to war economies involved substantial reorganization of industries, labor, and financial systems. Governments across Europe, including those in Britain, France, Germany, and others, prioritized military production over civilian industries, leading to significant economic changes. Industrial reallocation. Civilian industries were converted to produce military supplies, munitions, uniforms, and vehicles, leaving fewer consumer goods and basic necessities. Heavy industries like steel and coal mining became critical for producing weapons and supporting armies, and factories were repurposed to meet the demand for military equipment. Labor mobilization. The large number of men sent to the front lines created labor shortages, leading to the increased employment of women and the elderly in factories and other essential sectors. This labor shift was especially significant in Britain and Germany, where women's workforce participation rose dramatically. The inclusion of women in the labor force marked a pivotal shift in traditional roles and sparked changes in labor rights that lasted long after the war. Government debt and war bonds. To finance the war, governments borrowed heavily from their populations and from international lenders, issuing war bonds and taking out loans primarily from the United States. By the end of the war, European nations had accumulated massive debts. Britain and France, for instance, had borrowed extensively from American banks, making the United States a major post-war creditor. Printing money to cover shortfalls also fueled inflation in many countries, weakening national currencies and creating post-war economic challenges. Economic disruption and scarcity. The shift to war economies led to shortages of essential goods, including food and medical supplies, with trade routes disrupted by blockades, particularly by the British Navy against the Central Powers. Resources were scarce, and prices surged. In Germany, for instance, food and fuel shortages led to starvation and widespread hardship, culminating in what became known as the Turnip Winter of 19,161,917 The forced reliance on domestic production drove up prices and increased economic strain for ordinary citizens, creating discontent that would later fuel social and political upheaval. Treaty of Versailles' economic consequences for Germany. Signed in 1919, the Treaty of Versailles imposed punitive measures on Germany, which had devastating economic consequences. The treaty forced Germany to accept full responsibility for the war under the War Guilt Clause, Article 231, and to pay substantial reparations to allied nations, especially France and Belgium, whose territories had been severely damaged. War reparations and economic strain. Germany was required to pay 132 billion gold marks, roughly equivalent to $33 billion at the time, a sum that far exceeded its economic capacity. These payments created severe financial strain, as Germany had already suffered from war-related debt and inflation. To meet its reparations, Germany's government began printing more money, which led to hyperinflation. By the early 1920s, the German mark's value had collapsed, wiping out savings and impoverishing countless citizens. Territorial losses and industrial impact. The treaty also forced Germany to cede significant territories, including Alsace-Lorraine to France, and parts of Prussia to the newly formed Poland. These territories contained valuable natural resources, particularly coal, which Germany had relied on for industrial production. The loss of these regions weakened Germany's industrial capacity, limiting its ability to generate revenue and further intensifying its economic crisis. Military limitations and economic repercussions. The treaty imposed strict limits on the size of Germany's military, drastically reducing its army and prohibiting a full-scale navy and air force. This restriction weakened Germany's economic potential by limiting military-related industries that had been significant sources of employment and production during the war. The resulting unemployment and economic downturn added to the social unrest and dissatisfaction with the Weimar government, which many Germans saw as complicit in the humiliating terms of the treaty. Long-term economic and political ramifications.